This week on the All-American Legacy podcast.
At the time, there was no real role for a peacetime army in the way that we think of ourselves as the Army right now. World War I came to an end, and the country didn't really understand having a fully functioning standing army with no war.
This is the 82nd Airborne Division, fearless among fighting units.
From Fort Bragg, home of the Airborne and the center of the military universe, this is the All-American Legacy podcast. An inside look at the 100-year history of the 82nd.
They are all American, all the way.
Welcome back to the All-American Legacy podcast. I'm your host for today, Staff Sergeant Will Rainier. I'm joined today by 82nd Airborne Division Public Affairs Officer and historian Lieutenant Colonel Joe Bacino. Sir, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks. And we are finally through World War I.
Yeah, absolutely. So here, the first episode's kind of talking about the birth of the division, and as we made it through World War I, just close out some of the highlights, I guess, of World War I before we kind of start to transition away.
So 5 months of combat for the division in World War I, 2 Medal of Honor recipients, Pike and York. We talked about Emery Pike and Alvin York. 3 Distinguished Service Medals, 85 Distinguished Service Crosses, and then 1,035 killed, and more than 6,000 soldiers were wounded. So those are, by comparison, those are average to slightly lower than average for a division that participated in World War I. It's important to not oversell or overstate the division's role in World War I. We served honorably, certainly. We were in the critical moments in the Meuse-Argonne and Saint-Mihiel. But we weren't a contributor to the success of that war in the way that the division was in World War II.
And so to kind of put a bow on the war, the 82nd Infantry Division at the time didn't necessarily contribute as much as we would in World War II, but we definitely were in some of the critical points in time during that conflict. The 82nd was there. You look at the Meuse-Argonne, and definitely the things that the stories that we were able to tell over the past few podcasts, you can really see the impact that the unit had even in its early days.
Yeah, I think we don't want to oversell or overstate the division's role in World War I. We just want to report on it.
And if you remember back in episode 2, we kind of teased the fact that the division did not disband after the war, even though it seems like there throughout the 20s and 30s into the 40s, there was really not anything to talk about. But the division wasn't dead, as a lot of people may think.
That's right. Most people believe there was no 82nd Division from 1919 until 1942. In fact, a lot of the World War II histories written of the division, the Phil Nordyke book certainly comes to mind, All American All the Way, report it that way, that there was no 82nd Division after World War I all the way to 1942. That is not the case. The division was demobilized after World War I, meaning that it was removed from the active force, but the division was never disbanded. It's never disbanded in its 100-year history. The 82nd remained an Army division, but as a structure only.
And so when we talk about a structure, it's essentially, I guess, the concept of the division was there, just the positions, the slots weren't being manned, but they were available and could be manned if necessary.
Right, exactly. It was a division in paper, and it had the construct of a division, what we now call the MTO, the duty positions and the organizational structure. There were no people in it for at least 1919 to 1921, but it was always there. It was always in existence.
I've got it right here, and the document opens with, the 82nd Division has passed into history. Pretty finite wording there. Yeah,
that's an unfortunate word choice, and it's created to an awful lot of confusion since then, because that historians refer to that document. At the time, there was no real role for a peacetime army in the way that we think of ourselves as the Army right now. World War I came to an end, and the country didn't really understand having a fully functioning standing army with no war. So World War I ended. The War Department says, okay, we're going to retain the 82nd. Let's keep the structure. And right now we've got an armistice, but Germany could rise once again. And if so, we can fill this structure. We can surge troops and officers into this existing structure. So that happened in 1919. And then 2 years later, in 1921, the War Department said, look, we can't fight a war without these units at least trained to some level. So the 82nd must be trained should something happen. So let's man the 82nd in the drilling reserve.
So what we have now is essentially in 1921, the 82nd doesn't go from an active to an inactive unit. It's just placed into that reserve status.
Yes. So the War Department kept a cadre of officers and a group of trained soldiers in the 82nd in the reserves.
Now, what's the real benefit of that, though?
Well, the country wanted to return to normalcy after the war. World War I was really a pivotal moment in American history. It was devastating to the country. And we were suddenly an army at peace and a country at peace. And so when you think about, the army at war in Iraq and Afghanistan, that involves a very specific part of the United States. That involves the 1% of the people that serve in the United States military. Not so in World War I. It involved everybody of military age, every military age male. And so the country wanted its draftees to go back to work, to work on the farms, to work on mills, to go back to normal jobs, businesses, and go back to their cities and farms. And so in order to do that, the regular army was limited to 280,000 people.
And when you think about it in the context of today, we're standing at about 480,000 in our regular army. So that's, almost half of what we have now is what we had determined to keep as our standing army then.
Right, exactly. And so particularly if you think about an army like that army at that time, 1921, an army that was based on the notion of trench warfare, on putting people on the line and a kind of attrition of infantry soldiers. 280,000 is a very, very small force. So with 280,000 people, divisions like the 82nd could not man a full division, but they can keep a division on paper. And so that is what we did. Then the War Department realized, look, these soldiers need to be trained if we have to fight the Germans again. Let's put them in the reserves and have them train on the weekends.
So at the time, the division was headquartered in Camp Gordon, Georgia. And when it goes into the reserves, does it stay there or where does it go from there?
The headquarters of the 82nd in 1921 in the reserves was stood up in South Carolina. And most of the subordinate units were in Georgia, Tennessee, and Florida.
And that sounds like some of the same parts of the country where the original soldiers were actually drafted in from in 1917 when they stood up the division.
Exactly. You're exactly right. In 1917, the division was formed with recruits from the southern states. And maybe that's one thing we should explain a little bit here. The All-American Division did not always represent all of America. In August of 1917, the division was formed with draftees from the South. Then, in November of 1917, about 90 days after the division was initially formed, the War Department started pulling thousands of soldiers out of the 82nd to fill the new divisions popping up all over the country to fight the war. And these soldiers from the South that were moved to other divisions, were backfilled by new draftees from the East, from the Midwest, the Pacific Coast. And that is how we came to have soldiers from all 48 states.
And hence, all Americans. So inside of that reserve status, the division wouldn't have any, I guess, what we would call significant contributions, or there really wasn't much going on. So over the next 24 or so years until 1942 is really when we hit our next real milestone and the division's rebirth for the Second World War as the 82nd Airborne Division. And we're finally going to get to that point in history in next week's episode.
Yes, we finally get to the airborne stuff next week.
And so I'm sure all of you listening are very excited for that. Of course, the airborne part of the division's history is easily the most well-known and one of the most beloved parts that really added to the legacy and the lore of the 82nd Division. So let's transition to a new segment. And I want to do this a little bit more throughout the rest of the podcast. And essentially, just tell me something that I didn't know about the 82nd Airborne Division.
Sure. Well, where do you think the division's greeting all the way comes from?
I actually read this book, the Colonel Magellan's book, All the Way to Berlin, and I believe it comes from, as we, in World War II, were pushing through to Berlin, the 82nd Airborne Division, when they received their orders, and they were asked, what are you doing? We're going all the way to Berlin. And so that's where it really started.
You're wrong.
Oh, okay. So where did it come?
And that's a common mistake. A lot of historians make this mistake as well. I think people get confused by the title of the James Magellan's book. But the salute response of all the way has nothing to do with World War II at all. It was not developed until 1958. And it was developed by a Major James Riff, who was the S3 for 2nd Brigade of the 503rd. James Riff later retired as a colonel, and now in his 90s is still living in Virginia. But, you think about when you greet an officer, you say, "All the way, sir," and the officer responds with "Airborne." That was something that, "All the way, sir," was something that Major Jim Riff came up with. He just thought it was something that would be kind of clever and spirited and motivating. And then, of course, it caught on very fast. It spread throughout the division. It was only meant for 2nd to 503rd. It spread throughout the division, and today is still universal in the division. So, we're one of the few divisions that has a universal greeting, "All the way, sir." A lot of other divisions, they go by their brigade or their battalion greeting. Here we go with "All the way, Airborne." We want to thank Staff Sergeant Will Rainier for that discussion. We learned what happened to the division after the Great War and before it was airborne. I'm joined now by Master Sergeant Dan Bailey. Master Sergeant Bailey is new to the All-American Legacy podcast, but he's not new to the 82nd Airborne Division.
Yes, sir. It's great to be here. Great to be a part of the team once again. I feel like this is a good transition episode for me to jump in on, and we're in between the important moments.
Yeah, nothing too exciting happened in this episode.
But there was a lot of information. We also have your discussion with Dr. Phil Nash. Who is he?
Dr. Phil Nash is an associate professor of history at Penn State. He does a lot of these kinds of shows and these podcasts. He's the kind of historian who makes history accessible and understandable, which is why he's requested a lot to do this kind of interview. He spoke with us about exactly what we're talking about here, which was the period between World War I and World War II and the mood of the country and the place of the Army during that time. Phil, Dr. Nash, thanks for being here. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
On the All-American Legacy podcast. What was the prevailing mood of the country at the end of World War I?
Right. Well, I think part of the mood was, and this is important for the context here, part of the mood was we had just obviously gone sort of all in for our first war in Europe, and we had mobilized massively, right? We had taken a pre-war army of about 100,000 men and expanded it to about 4 million in a very brief period. And then we were actively involved in the war in Europe, obviously. And then afterwards, I think there was a bit of, called buyer's remorse or some regret. A lot of Americans felt like they had been played. And in other words, this sort of first foray into a European war in Europe, I think a lot of people regretted and wanted to return to our traditions. That's part of the story. The other part of the story in the larger context is this long-standing tradition going back to the origins of the Republic, and that's this opposition to having a large standing army. For most of our history, including before World War I, our tradition was to have virtually a very, well, I won't say no, but a very, very small standing army, and that in case of war, then we would expand it as much as we needed. We did this before the Civil War, we did this in 1898, and we did it in 1917 as well, taking a very, very small army and making it very large. And then the expectation traditionally was then when the war is over, you go back to the norm, which is you rapidly shrink the army back to its previous size. Now, the army in the 1920s was slightly larger than before World War I, but still it was much closer to its standard size. I think it was about 150,000 men in the 1920s. Which is that's a tiny fraction of the 4 million we had geared up to during World War I. So I think that's part of the big picture. We were I mean, we live in a world now where we are used to decades of the United States playing a sort of permanent role in preserving world security. And in 1919, 1920, we had an opportunity to do that, and we essentially declined. We didn't join the League of Nations. We didn't join the World Court. We basically decided to go back to what we had been, and in military terms, that is mainly as a regional power, much more concerned with things like hemispheric security, security of the Panama Canal and the Caribbean, and the one exception being, or the major exception being our possession in the Philippines. That was our big security nightmare, defending these islands, which were basically on the doorstep of East Asia. But all those seem to require or seem to demand only a small army. The Navy is kind of a different story. But in other words, I think there was a return to the norm, which is a sense that we really don't need a massive standing army. Massive standing armies are bad things because they are costly and they are generally a symbol of tyranny. And so we'll return to our norm of just gearing down and gearing up and gearing down and gearing up, depending upon the needs created by a war.
Well, our army is the People's Army. We operate at the discretion of the people, and so you see these kind of ideas manifest throughout the life of the division. And
absolutely.
The 100-year history of the 82nd really does parallel the last 100 years in this country. So you see the philosophical arguments you're representing here have a real impact on the division. The division was really in structure only, really existed only on paper.
Sure.
So, but there were the concept of reversibility was there. So what we would now call, I think, force structure. So there was a division. You could mass a force into these ranks. There was a drilling reserve that was still a cadre of officers that maintained readiness or was still trained.
Right.
And you could push things in there very quickly should you need to fight another large-scale war. What was looming? Was there a sense that there was another big war looming?
No, not immediately. Not in the 1920s. 1920s, and it's a little more complicated than I think some people think, because there's this still a fixation on isolationism, this idea that we went back into our shell, which we did not do in a lot of ways. But we did have, for example, a very successful, at least in the short term, naval arms control agreement, the sort of five-power naval treaty. The world was at peace in the 1920s. Threats to peace in the past, such as Germany, really weren't threats anymore because of the Versailles Treaty, at least not in the short term. Long term, it's a different story. But yeah, I think there was not a sense in the 1920s, certainly, that a war was in the offing. That doesn't change until the 1930s. But I think something I probably should have stressed a minute ago. A lot of what you mentioned in terms of the shrinking of the size of the army is budgetary. In the 20s, there is fiscally a very conservative government and a very conservative Congress. And in the 1920s, for example, the army leaders only get typically about half of the money they ask for from Congress. So I think the armed forces would have been happier with at least a slightly bigger army, and Congress was denying them. And then, of course, in the early 1930s, the Depression hits. And then, of course, the funding really dries up. So this really is sort of you might call it the doldrums in the history of the Army. If you look at people like someone like Dwight Eisenhower, I forget the exact stats, I think he is a major for 15 years. In other words, some of the junior and mid-level officers in the Army spend an enormous amount of time in rank because there are no opportunities for promotion, because the size of the Army is static and it's not growing at all.
Yeah, so what's interesting, I think, is that we've got the armistice that brings an end to World War I on November 11th of 1918,
Mm-hmm.
And then we go through this slowing down period, this period where we make the Army much smaller,
right.
And then as we start to mobilize, when I started reading about the mobilization for World War II, we were about as unprepared for that as we were for World War I. So it seems like some of those lessons may not have been fully learned or at least acknowledged.
I mean, there is some effort to catch up in the, I'd say, actually 2 years, well, I'll say a year and a half before Pearl Harbor. I think a really important turning point is in the summer of 1940 when France falls. And that, I think a lot of people around the world, not just in Washington, a lot of people were counting on the French to put up a longer fight, right? I think everyone, including in Washington, they thought it would be like World War I, where the French and the Germans would slug it out for years, and that would buy us some time. Well, of course, France collapses in 6 weeks. And that's when the United States really starts to gear up and starts to realize that we don't want to be caught like we were in 1917. And so there is an expansion. For example, in August of 1940, we pass our first peacetime draft. Roosevelt orders a massive expansion of our Army Air Corps. And we do put in place, I would say, more serious building blocks or a better capacity to expand in 1940 and 41 than you had in 1939. So I think we, in other words, it's bad. You're absolutely right, and we were not really well prepared, but I think it could have been a lot worse. And for example, if you look, I have this little factoid here. In 1935, around the mid-1930s, we did not have a single combat-ready division. And we had not, we did not have our first genuine corps-sized maneuver until April of 1940. So we are, I mean, you're right, we were playing catch-up, but I think in that period before Pearl Harbor, we are taking some first steps to make it so we can expand our Army radically when the time came in December 1941.
Yeah, and I guess that actually brings us pretty nicely into next week, where we're going to talk about the division's role in preparing for World War II and its transition to an airborne force. So no, I appreciate it, Dr. Nash. Thanks greatly for your time.
My pleasure. I'll look forward to the podcast.
For our final piece today, we have Captain Luke Willenberg, a Catholic chaplain here in the 82nd Airborne Division, talking about one of our great traditions.
We're talking to Chaplain Luke Willenberg. He is a captain in the Army, a Catholic priest, and he is a chaplain in the 82nd Airborne Division.
Great to be here, sir.
And you are from Poland?
All the way from Poland, sir. That's correct.
How long have you been in the 82nd Airborne Division?
I've been in 82nd since May 2015. Came to division right after All-American Week.
All right.
2015.
St. Michael is one of our great traditions in the division. Where does that tradition come from?
Yes, sir. St. Michael has been a patron of paratroopers in 82nd Airborne Division since Second World War. There's really no exact date, but the tradition goes down to 1945, February 1945, when St. Michael was officially recognized as a patron of the paratroopers. Where the soldiers during the Second World War were actually given the medals of St. Michael as a sign of God's protection upon them.
What does it mean today? What does St. Michael mean to the division today?
I think St. Michael, being the special angel or archangel of God who was sent by God to defeat the Satan, I think we can speak about so many things that apply to us, that we are called to do as soldiers, as paratroopers, as simply making this world a better place by what we do every single day, by our service to God and our service to our country, and having St. Michael as our patron, our intercessor out there in heaven, as a sign of God's protection upon us is a great thing.
Well, what we do is dangerous, so I guess we need all the protection we can get here. How does the 82nd Airborne Division honor this tradition today?
We honor the tradition of St. Michael almost every time we jump. Usually the chaplains of 82nd, they will conduct a quick prayer, quick blessing when they invoke the name of St. Michael to protect us as we about to jump from perfectly fine airplane and conduct our duties. But also we honor St. Michael in a few other ways. The feast of St. Michael is usually September. September 29th is the day of St. Michael, when the archangel is recognized in the Catholic tradition. Usually around that time, as a division, we conduct what's called St. Michael's Jump. Usually it's an event put together by the division chaplain, and paratroopers have opportunity to come together, jump from the airplane, and then simply enjoy this day, celebrate our patron feast by doing what we're doing, simply jumping, having St. Michael on our shoulder as our protector.
And then after you jump, there's some sort of organizational type discussion afterwards?
Usually what we do, as a division, we have St. Michael's medals that we usually hand out to paratroopers that they wear with great pride, usually with their dog tags, as a sign that St. Michael's with them all the time. I have the medal with me right here. But also we conduct a quick prayer, quick invocation, and also remind and teach our paratroopers, educate them about this wonderful tradition that we carry on as a division.
And so our history is a little bit steeped in St. Michael. Many people know and have read the Guy Lafaro book, The Sword of St. Michael, that in many ways is the definitive anthology of our World War II wartime history. In the town of St. Mary Glace, the town we liberated on D-Day, shortly after D-Day, there is a stained glass representation of St. Michael in the town square, in the church in the town square. You see St. Michael in our All-American Chapel, and you see a lot of these medallions all over the division.
Mm-hmm. That's correct. St. Michael is usually represented or depicted in the art as this angelic warrior, usually with the sword, with helmet and shield, simply fighting the devil, and the devil is usually in his feet being defeated. So pretty powerful image of him being this angelic warrior, something that we try to simply do, or we do it as paratroopers, as soldiers.
Well, Chaplain Willen Berg, thanks for your time. We know these traditions are important, but it's also important that we understand their origins.
Definitely.
Well, that was really, I actually did not know that. That was pretty interesting.
Yeah, and that really is kind of the purpose of this podcast series as a whole, just finding those stories of the 100-year legacy of the All-American Division and being able to get past some of the more popular ones, the 5 combat jumps, the 5 Medal of Honor recipients. While they're very important and very critical to the history of our division, there really is a lot more to be said about the All-Americans.
Yeah, and I think as you and I continue on this project, we're finding a lot of these really neat, really cool stories and almost historical artifacts about the division. And as we kind of do a deep dive and break down the broader history, we're finding that there's a lot of myths out there, there's a lot of legends out there, and there's also a lot of really unknown things and unknown people, places, things.
So when you think about the chronological history of the division, we are essentially right there before 1942. We've gone all the way through World War I. We've kind of discussed what happened after World War I. And next week, we really get into the cool airborne stuff that the 82nd is universally known for.
And this is what I think people around the world really want to hear from this podcast. Our Airborne legacy starts next week, and we're pretty excited.
So as we wrap up today, just want to remind everyone the All-American Legacy podcast is produced by the 82nd Airborne Division Public Affairs Office. Special thanks today to Bob Lindy and the Public Affairs team from the U.S. Army John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center. for use of their studio and for their first-class production work. They gave us a lot of help and have throughout this entire project. Make sure you rate us and leave a review on iTunes or Google, wherever you get your podcast, and share this with a friend. All of those things help our ratings and help us get this podcast to more listeners so we can share the incredible legacy of the All-American Division. Once again, thanks for listening from Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I'm Staff Sergeant Will Rainier, Airborne all the way.
Next week on the All-American Legacy Podcast.
So this was a military aid to President Roosevelt, and he wanted to know about airborne operations. So this colonel hands Major Bill Lee the phone and says, tell this man everything he wants to know.
As they expand the Army and start to build the 99 Infantry Divisions, the 82nd is called up and sent to Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, as a standard infantry division of the time.
The first jump from an aircraft in flight for the Tesla team happened on August 15th, 1940.
18 men in 10 seconds. Their first jump.
And then in 1942, of course, we were reorganized in Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, as the Airborne Division.
When they told us we were the best damn fighting outfit in the world, we believed it. All we had to do was to prove it.